Welcome to Market Movers. My name is Benjamin Poole, head trader here at Verified Investing. Today is the 29th of March 2026. And in this video, I'm going to be covering US oil. That is going to be the main culprit that's driving the S&P and the Nasdaq down. I'm also going to be going over a couple parallel channels that I'm identified in both the SPX and the NDX that are holding support once those decide to break. Even if oil decides to get a breakdown, we could see a further move in the markets. But a couple things that I'm eyeing in all of these charts. So the first one we're going to go over is US oil. So here's this move up on the US oil charts. First thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to zoom way out in the charts. So this goes back to 2012. See all this price consolidation right at the $100 whole round number on US oil. And then you zoom back in, go all the way to this low pivot area right here from the highs of 2022, and then even into the late part of 2022. That is actually where we're currently sitting on the US oil chart, and this is the futures at $100.81 per barrel. As you can see, we've got this topping tail on the chart of US oil. So we're going to be facing a lot of resistance in this area based on previous price action, as well as this topping tail on the charts. So right now we're getting a little rejection at this 50% Fibonacci retracement. If we push through that, price of oil could head all the way up to about $104.83 a barrel. That's going to be your next level of resistance. If oil does decide to push up a little bit higher, then $111.26. And then my top exit price, basically the upper end of the charts would be $119.48 a barrel. Now, again, if we zoom way back out on these charts, look at all of this resistance. So $119 back, this goes back to 2022 towards the highs. So it could get as much as $123 or as high as $130 a barrel. However, with this topping tail still in place, I don't see it getting much higher than $111 or even $115 a barrel. That is going to be what's dictating what the S&P 500 is doing. So keep this on your radar. Another thing that I'm also eyeing is this upswing trend line. Connected slow pivot here, secondary pivot here, and then as you can see, it's hit for the third time and gotten this bounce. Once this upswing trend line does break, US oil is going to come back in to these pivot tops right here, about $65 a barrel. Let's jump into the S&P 500 or the SPX S&P 500 index. Here's this parallel channel that I was mentioning earlier in the video. So I'm going to have to zoom way out in the charts. This upswing parallel channel is really key to look at. So you've got this pivot top that goes back to the highs of December 2022. Secondary pivot right here. This is what helps create this upswing parallel channel. That was the second hit, third hit, fourth hit, fifth hit. Do you notice how the upper end of this parallel channel gets hit and then gets respected? Now all of a sudden we're putting in this rounded top on the SPX. One other thing that I like to notice on a parallel channel is the midline. Every time this midline was hit, it's either offered some support, or once it's gotten below, it's offered some resistance. So this is going to be the key resistance level on the SPX now that we're below it. Price action, if US oil does get a bid to the upside or the downside, starts to sell off on US oil, I do anticipate the SPX to head higher. But we're going to get a huge rejection right here, about $69,019, or all the way up to about $69,042, depending on when it hits the midline. But this is going to be a key resistance level for the SPX. Once we start breaking below this parallel channel, as you can see, we're getting some support at $63,061.99, or excuse me, $6,361.99. That is where your ton of support is laying. Once we finally break this level, I think ultimately we're heading down to $6,094.65, somewhere in this area, all the way down to these low pivots right here, about 57.74.59. This is going to be basically your key support zone on the SPX. If we can get a failure or rejection, if we start closing below and confirm below, that is where the downside targets are for the SPX. Even if oil decides to head a little bit lower. But we have to confirm below this parallel channel, and then we could actually play this on a possible retrace. So this is the parallel channel that I'm looking at. It's offering solid support, but doesn't necessarily mean we're breaking down yet because we haven't confirmed below. This could be a fake out. And I know we did get this huge fall on the back of the tariff news back in April. So it did get pretty decently outside of this parallel channel on the SPX. However, if you zoom back in, you've got this low pivot point here and then a little bit of price consolidation. So this gives me an idea of where the lower end of the parallel channel is currently sitting. Now, last but not least, let's go into the NDX. So the NDX has a little bit better of a parallel channel because of this price consolidation right here. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit more, even a little bit more. So we've got this pivot top here from the highs of August 2022, secondary pivot top. Here's the third pivot where price got rejected. And then also notice the midline of this parallel channel. It got respected on the top end, got rejected, and then all of a sudden it was resistance, finally got above, tried to make a run, but then the midline was so much rejection or so much resistance that it actually pushed it down, created the lower end of this parallel channel, came back up, and then price consolidated right around the midline. Now that we're below the midline of this parallel channel, on a bid to the upside, if the NDX can push up a little bit higher, you're going to get a nice rejection around 25,200, depending on where, all the way up to like $25,345. Again, depending on what hits the midline of this parallel channel. Not only do you have the midline, but look at all of this price consolidation that used to be support. Now it's going to be acting as resistance. As you can see, the lower end of this parallel channel is just getting hit right now. So we haven't actually closed below this trend line or this parallel channel on a daily closing basis. So here's what I'm looking for. I'm actually looking for a bid below, a continuation move lower, and then a retrace to basically to the upper end of the, back to the lower end of the parallel channel from the underbelly. That is where it's likely to get rejected. And then ultimately the NDX is coming down to about $22,091.76. That is where your first level support is. Just like the SPX, I have to look for additional support. And that's going to be right about in this area where you've seen previous price consolidation right here, low pivot area, $20,562.57. That is where you're going to get a pretty solid bounce based on previous price action in the charts. So right now, although we are at the lower end, we can actually anticipate a little bit of bounce going into Monday. But what we have to do is we actually have to wait and see what happens to the US oil charts when the markets open or when the futures decide to open up. Because if they start opening up, US oil starts opening up higher, then the SPX and the NDX will actually end up opening up quite a bit lower. I do anticipate some sort of a little bit of bounce tomorrow and the US oil selling off just because that's what's happened the last couple of weeks. There's some news, some positive news about the potential war in Iran that's winding down, or there's negotiations. And that's usually what happens. And so that's why I do anticipate at least a little bit of a bounce. Right now, though, we are technically now more in of a bearish pattern than we are a bullish pattern on both the SPX and the NDX. And that doesn't necessarily mean that if oil continues to drop, that these are going to surge to the upside. We have a lot of work to do now that we're at the lower end of the parallel channels on both the SPY or the SPX and the NDX. So it'll be interesting to see what happens going forward with oil and the S&P 500, and if the if the SPX decides it wants to fall off, that's really going to take the rest of the markets down with it, and that's why these three charts are my market movers. My name is Benjamin Poole, head trader of Verified Investing. We'll see you guys next time in the charts. You guys have a great rest of your day. Take care.